Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. It is really great to have you with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in.
So, if you are joining us, you're likely the kind of person who, actively tries to look past those daily breaking news alerts.
Right.
You want to truly understand the really hidden currents shaping our world. And, well, you have absolutely come to the right place for that today.
You definitely have.
Today, our mission is to decode one of the most complex, high-stakes geopolitical chessboards on the planet right now. We are talking about Southeast Asia.
It's a fascinating region.
It really is. We are going to explore exactly how smaller developing nations manage to not just survive, but actively thrive when you have two massive global powers, the United States and the People's Republic of China, engaged in this intense, multidimensional strategic tug-of-war right in their literal backyard.
And it is a remarkable dynamic to watch unfold. It's one that really demands a sophisticated level of analysis, I think.
For sure.
We have this tendency, particularly in Western media, to look at global politics through a highly binary lens. We just sort of assume...
Like a you're with us or against us kind of thing.
Exactly. We operate under this assumption that smaller nations inherently lack agency, that when push comes to shove, they inevitably have to align themselves definitively with one superpower or the other.
Right.
But what we are observing on the ground in Southeast Asia completely upends that traditional assumption. The diplomatic and economic strategies employed in this specific region are incredibly advanced.
Yeah, and that is exactly what makes this topic so compelling for a deep dive. We're going to pull back the curtain today and examine the reality that everything you might think you know about countries being forced into picking sides is, well, it's entirely wrong.
It really is.
Southeast Asia has developed this uniquely brilliant survival playbook. And to help you and I understand the mechanics of this playbook, we are drawing on a stack of truly exceptional scholarly sources today.
Some fantastic research out there right now.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at Minjiang Li's deeply insightful research on geoeconomics and statecraft. We have Evelyn Goh's brilliant framework detailing the preferred hierarchical order of the region.
That's a crucial one.
Yeah. And Ewan Graham's rigorous analysis of the United States' rebalance to Asia and the impact of geography. We're also digging into David Shambaugh's comprehensive study outlining the concept of competitive coexistence. And finally, Xiaofeng Chen's hard data breakdown of exactly how different regional governments are reacting to these massive tectonic shifts in power.
Those scholars provide a wealth of empirical data and theoretical frameworks that are they're absolutely essential.
Yeah, you really can't understand the region without them.
Right. Because if we want to move beyond the simplistic sensationalist narratives that completely dominate the daily news cycle, we have to look at the structural architecture of the region's diplomacy. These sources allow us to do exactly that. They let us analyze the long-term strategic calculations that actually drive the behavior of these states.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start by examining the respective playbooks of the giants in the room.
Makes sense. Start at the top.
Yeah, looking first at the People's Republic of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. Because when you read standard geopolitical commentary, the Belt and Road Initiative is almost exclusively portrayed as this grand, meticulously calculated, multi-decade master plan, right?
Yes, the mastermind narrative.
Exactly. Hatched in Beijing to systematically conquer the globe through infrastructure debt. But Minjiang Li's analysis completely challenges that narrative from the very first page.
It absolutely does. And this is where historical context is just vital. What's fascinating here is that the Belt and Road Initiative was not originally conceived as some mastermind geopolitical plot for global hegemony.
It really wasn't.
Not at all. If we trace its origins back to its inception around 2013, according to Minjiang Li's rigorous research, the initiative actually started primarily as an urgent economic solution to a very pressing internal domestic crisis within the People's Republic of China.
We are talking about the massive issue of industrial overcapacity, right?
Yes.
Because following the 2008 global financial crisis, the government in Beijing initiated a massive domestic stimulus package.
Precisely. They injected roughly 4 trillion yuan into their own economy to stave off the worst effects of the global recession.
Just a staggering amount of money.
And a massive portion of that capital went directly into domestic infrastructure. For years, the People's Republic of China built up an unprecedented capacity in heavy industries. We're talking steel production, cement manufacturing, glass making, and heavy construction equipment.
They just built everything.
They created an absolute juggernaut of state-owned construction enterprises to fuel their own internal modernization. They built out an unparalleled high-speed rail network and entirely new urban centers. But as their domestic infrastructure needs inevitably began to be met.
You can only build so many roads inside one country.
Exactly. Their internal growth started to naturally plateau, and they faced an enormous structural problem.
Right, because they had all these factories churning out millions of tons of steel and cement, and millions of workers employed by these state-owned enterprises. But suddenly, the domestic demand was shrinking.
It was drying up.
And you can't just shut down industries of that scale overnight without risking massive domestic unemployment and social instability.
Exactly. The sheer scale of the overcapacity was staggering. They were producing more steel in a few months than many major industrialized nations produced in an entire year. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which was originally conceptualized and announced as the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, was essentially born as a spatial fix.
A spatial fix, that's a great term.
Yeah, it's a strategy to export that massive excess capacity. It was about keeping Chinese factories running, keeping domestic supply chains solvent, and keeping Chinese workers employed. And how do you do that? By shifting the construction of roads, bridges, hydroelectric dams, and deep water ports beyond their own borders into neighboring developing nations.
So in its infancy, it was far less about planting geopolitical flags on a world map and much more about keeping the domestic economic engine from stalling out and causing an internal crisis.
That was the primary driver.
But, as Mingjiang Li points out in his research, you cannot execute an economic policy of that magnitude without it changing the geopolitical landscape.
It's impossible.
When you start pledging hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure across the entire Indo-Pacific region, that sheer volume of economic activity is going to naturally transform into geostrategy.
You really cannot decouple economics from geopolitics at that immense scale. Economic activities inherently generate geopolitical intentions and ultimately geopolitical consequences.
Yeah, follow the money.
Right. Consider the practical reality. When the People's Republic of China finances, designs, and built a massive deep-water port or a vital energy pipeline in a neighboring developing country, they suddenly have a vested, multi-decade interest in the internal security and political stability of that specific country.
That makes perfect sense.
Furthermore, they develop a vital national interest in securing the maritime sea lanes that connect that new infrastructure back to their own mainland.
It creates a snowball effect. You build the port, now you need to protect the port. You send workers, now you need to ensure the safety of your citizens abroad.
Exactly. Over time, what began as an economic pressure release valve naturally evolved into a comprehensive foreign policy framework. The protection of overseas investments, supply chains, and expatriate citizens has increasingly become a core developmental interest for Beijing.
Had to adapt.
Yes. And to protect those newly globalized interests, they must subsequently reshape their international security policy, modernize their naval capabilities, and expand their diplomatic footprint. The economic policy catalyzed a geopolitical transformation.
And obviously the rest of the world, especially the United States, is watching this massive, unprecedented flow of capital and concrete, and they are reacting to it. That brings us to the countermove. We are talking about the United States' rebalance or pivot to Asia, which over multiple administrations eventually evolved into the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy.
A major shift in focus.
Yeah, and we are leaning heavily on the research of David Shenbaugh and Ewan Graham here. And they describe the current dynamic between the United States and the People's Republic of China not as a renewed Cold War, but utilizing a specific framework called competitive coexistence.
That is a crucial and highly nuanced distinction. In the media, it is incredibly tempting to take the old United States-Soviet Union dynamic and just map it directly onto this current relationship.
It's the easy comparison.
It is, but it simply does not fit the empirical reality. During the original Cold War, the rivalry was deeply zero-sum, it was intensely ideological, and perhaps most importantly, the two superpower economies were almost entirely isolated from one another.
They barely traded.
Right. Today, the United States and the People's Republic of China operate within the same globalized system. Their economies, supply chains, and financial markets are deeply and complexly intertwined.
Right. You cannot isolate two economies that do hundreds of billions of dollars in bilateral trade every single year without causing catastrophic damage to both. So how does David Shambaugh define competitive coexistence then?
Shambaugh uses the concept of competitive coexistence to describe a systemic rivalry that is absolutely real and highly consequential, but operates in a manner that is soft and indirect rather than kinetic.
Okay, so less about firing missiles.
Exactly. Both of these massive powers are primarily focused on advancing their own positive interests. They're trying to expand their own economic ties, strengthen their own diplomatic networks, and set the technological standards of the future. The primary goal is to outcompete the other in terms of influence and market share, rather than directly attempting to sabotage, undermine, or blow up the other's internal plans.
It sounds less like two armies lining up on a battlefield intending to destroy each other, and much more like two massive multinational corporations aggressively trying to win dominant market share in the same emerging market.
That's a great way to think about it.
They will fiercely compete on product, on pricing, on partnerships, but they aren't going to physically burn down the rival corporation's headquarters because they both rely on the same overarching financial system to survive.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. They are locked in a comprehensive competition that spans the military, diplomatic, technological, and economic domains. They are competing to shape the rules of the international order. But this competition deliberately stops short of direct kinetic confrontation.
Because the stakes are just too high?
Both leadership structures intimately understand that the costs of a direct military conflict would be catastrophically high, not just for their own respective nations, but it would effectively collapse the global economy upon which their own domestic stability relies.
So holding that framework of competitive coexistence in your mind, I want you to imagine you are sitting in the capital of a developing nation in Southeast Asia right now. You are a policymaker caught right in the gravitational pull of these two giants.
A very tough spot to be in.
Definitely. On one side, you have your massive, immediate geographic neighbor, the People's Republic of China. They are offering you billions of dollars in foreign direct investment and low-interest loans to build the high-speed rail lines, deep water ports, and modern power grids that you desperately need to pull your population out of poverty and drive industrialization.
That's a very tempting offer.
But on the other side, you have a distant but incredibly powerful superpower, the United States, offering you elite military training, advanced maritime security cooperation, and preferential access to the largest consumer markets on the planet. How do you choose between them?
The billion-dollar question.
Exactly. Well, the brilliant answer that these nations have formulated is you absolutely refuse to choose.
And this is exactly where the traditional Western-centric textbooks on international relations require a massive rewrite.
Time to throw them out.
Evelyn and Go's theoretical framework is absolutely essential for understanding this region. In classical international relations theory, which was largely developed by observing European history, when smaller, vulnerable states are faced with a rising, potentially threatening massive power, they are generally assumed to do one of two things.
Right. The classic two options.
They either balance against it, meaning they rapidly build up their own military and form rigid alliances with other countries, or a different external superpower to directly counter and deter the threat. Or, conversely, they bandwagon with it.
And bandwagoning means?
Bandwagoning means they surrender to the perceived inevitable reality, subserviently align their foreign policy with the rising power, and hope to be rewarded with economic scraps from the dominant power stable.
But Evelyn Go's research painstakingly points out that the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations are fundamentally doing neither of those traditional things. They aren't purely balancing, and they certainly aren't bandwagoning.
They are completely rejecting that binary framework. What's fascinating here is that the old European theories of balancing and bandwagoning completely failed to describe the complex reality on the ground in the Indo-Pacific.
They just don't apply.
These nations have looked at the traditional rules of statecraft, realized those rules would lead to their own marginalization or destruction, and simply thrown them out. Instead, they have adopted and refined a highly sophisticated strategy that Evelyn Go brilliantly terms omni-enmeshment.
Omni-enmeshment. Okay, let's unpack this. It is such a descriptive, almost visceral term. It sounds a bit like a corporate poison pill strategy.
It does have that flavor to it.
It is the diplomatic practice of intentionally and systematically tangling all of the major global powers into deep, inescapable webs of institutional, economic, and diplomatic relationships.
Tangling is the perfect word.
They don't just want bilateral relations with the United States and the People's Republic of China. They actively pull in Japan, they court India, they engage Australia, they sign trade pacts with the European Union. They want absolutely every major player heavily invested and entangled in their region.
That is the structural core of the strategy. The ultimate goal of omni-enmeshment is to socialize these giants into a regional normative order.
Hmm.
Think about it from the perspective of a member state of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Okay.
Inherently, if you are a smaller developing country, you are vulnerable to coercion. But if you can systematically weave a diplomatic and economic web where every single major global player has a massive, tangible stake in your specific region's stability,
Right.
you completely alter the strategic calculus of the superpowers.
It is essentially creating a system of mutually assured economic destruction.
Exactly.
If a conflict breaks out, or if one superpower tries to aggressively assert dominance, it wouldn't just be a localized tragedy, it would instantly disrupt the supply chains and financial interests of every major power on Earth.
Precisely. Through the architecture of omni-enmeshment, which they facilitate through multilateral forums like the East Asia Summit, they ensure that aggressive action or the outbreak of conflict becomes far too expensive for anyone to risk.
So smart.
They are constructing diplomatic shock absorbers. But importantly, this strategy is not solely about keeping the peace. It is equally about maintaining their own sovereign independence and autonomy. And that brings up the complementary concept that Go discusses, which is complex balancing.
Right, because the Association of Southeast Asian Nations isn't just relying on paper treaties or diplomatic forums to stay safe. They are actively manipulating their economic dependencies. Traditional balancing, as we discussed, is usually military signing a mutual defense treaty. But complex balancing recognizes that in the 21st century, economic security is national security.
Exactly. Complex balancing is the intentional, strategic diversification of a nation's dependencies. A state in this region might, out of geographic necessity, rely heavily on the People's Republic of China for massive infrastructure investments and as a primary market for their commodity exports.
They need that income.
However, to prevent that economic reliance from turning into political subservience, they will simultaneously and aggressively seek out foreign direct investment from Japan to build their manufacturing sector. They will negotiate free trade agreements to increase high-value exports to the European Union. And they will quietly deepen defense logistics and capacity-building agreements with the United States.
The overriding strategy is to meticulously ensure that no single external power ever holds all the cards across all the critical sectors of a nation's society.
Never put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. They are hedging their geopolitical bets in the most sophisticated way possible. But I want to push on this a bit, because here's the part of Evelyn Go's analysis that I found truly counterintuitive.
Okay, let's hear it.
Despite all this diplomatic maneuvering to avoid choosing sides and all this effort to keep everyone perfectly balanced and enmeshed, these Southeast Asian nations actually have a very specific, deeply held preference for what the final outcome should look like. They do not actually want a perfectly flat, egalitarian, multipolar world where every nation is equal. They actually deeply desire a hierarchical order.
They do, and this is a profound and often misunderstood insight into regional diplomacy. While you will rarely hear a diplomat state it so bluntly in a public forum, the actual on-the-ground actions, the defense procurement choices, and the private strategic calculations of these states reveal a clear, undeniable preference for a specific regional hierarchy.
Interesting.
And at the very top of that preferred hierarchy, they desire the United States to remain what Evelyn Go terms the superpower overlay.
So despite wanting to keep everyone enmeshed, they fundamentally want the United States to act as the ultimate ceiling of the region. They want Washington to maintain its military and naval preeminence as the unquestioned guarantor of maritime security and the ultimate structural check against any other single power achieving absolute regional hegemony.
Yes, the presence of the United States as that supreme overarching power is what provides the smaller states the strategic breathing room to maneuver. But it is a tiered system, and the second tier is equally important.
Okay, who's on the second tier?
Just below the United States in this preferred hierarchy, these nations want the People's Republic of China sitting comfortably and prosperously as the regional great power. The states in the region are highly pragmatic. They deeply acknowledge China's undeniable geographic reality, its immense historical and cultural weight, and its status as the primary economic engine of the Asian continent.
They want Beijing to be highly prosperous, deeply integrated, and highly influential because a wealthy China means a wealthy region.
It lifts everyone up.
They just do not want them to be militarily dominant over the entire system to the point where smaller states lose their sovereignty.
Exactly. It is a delicate balance of wanting the economic benefits of a rising neighbor without the security vulnerabilities. Then, below China, in this preferred hierarchy, they actively want major regional powers like Japan and India to be highly engaged, providing alternative sources of high-quality capital, technological expertise, and diplomatic support.
Diversifying the portfolio again.
Right? And right in the middle of all of this massive geopolitical architecture, acting as the indispensable diplomatic hub, the primary convening power, and the neutral ground for all these giants to meet, sits the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
It is an incredibly intricate system. They want the United States to provide the hard security umbrella that prevents hegemony. They want the People's Republic of China to provide the raw economic engine that drives development. They want Japan and India to serve as alternative options to prevent monopolization. And they want the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to be the central traffic cop, directing the flow of it all.
That's a perfect summary.
It is a brilliant strategy for survival. But omni-enmeshment isn't applied uniformly across the board. A nation's geography, whether they look out at the open ocean or share a porous land border with a giant, completely changes how they are forced to play this game.
That is a critical transition in our understanding. We cannot treat the region as a single homogeneous actor. While they have a strong collective diplomatic association, their individual strategic realities are vastly different.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Ewan Graham's analysis suggests that all this advanced strategic theory ultimately bows to a much older, unforgiving master: geography.
Geography is destiny, as they say.
Exactly. If we look at the stark divide between continental Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia, the survival playbooks look entirely different. Let's look at the map and start with the maritime states. The island archipelagos and peninsulas that are physically looking outward toward the oceans and, traditionally, toward the maritime power of the United States. The Philippines is the classic, perhaps most extreme example here.
The Philippines presents a textbook case of geography dictating strategy. They are an archipelago situated right on the volatile edge of the South China Sea.
Right in the thick of it.
Consequently, their most pressing existential foreign policy concerns are driven by acute maritime territorial disputes with the People's Republic of China regarding shoals, reefs, and exclusive economic zones. Because their primary security threat comes from the sea, their strategic orientation naturally gravitates toward the preeminent global maritime power.
Makes total sense.
This makes them arguably the keenest mutual defense treaty ally of the United States in the entire region. They rely heavily on Washington for security guarantees, joint patrols, and vital capacity building for their Navy and Coast Guard.
Right. Their geography forces a more traditional balancing behavior. But what fascinates me is how a country like Singapore plays this exact same maritime hand. Singapore is a tiny, highly developed island city-state at the very tip of the Malay Peninsula. They sit astride the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important maritime choke points in the world.
An incredibly strategic location.
Huge. But they aren't a formal mutual defense treaty ally of the United States, yet they function as a massive quasi-ally.
Singapore is the ultimate hyper-rational pragmatist of the region. They acutely understand their vulnerability as a small city-state reliant entirely on global trade. Therefore, they serve as a crucial, indispensable logistical hub for the United States military presence in the Indo-Pacific.
They roll out the red carpet.
They really do. They regularly host United States Navy littoral combat ships and provide vital, state-of-the-art port facilities for aircraft carriers and vessels transiting between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Their survival depends on the United States keeping those sea lanes open and secure.
But despite that deep military integration with Washington, they refuse to formalize an alliance that would alienate Beijing.
Exactly. Simultaneously, they carefully and deliberately maintain massive, deeply integrated economic and financial ties with the People's Republic of China. Singaporean leaders consistently and vocally advocate against any policies from Washington or Beijing that would force the region into a zero-sum, rigid division.
They want both.
They are fundamentally a maritime state. They require the United States for the ultimate security of the global commons, but their economic lifeblood, their prosperity, requires highly stable and lucrative relations with Beijing. It is a masterful, if precarious, balancing act.
And then, shifting to the largest player in the maritime domain, there is Indonesia, the heavyweight of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
A massive country.
A sprawling archipelago of over 17,000 islands, controlling vital sea lanes, with a massive population and a rapidly growing economy. But they play a very different geopolitical game than either the Philippines or Singapore.
Indonesia is guided by a profound historical and constitutional doctrine. They practice what they officially term dynamic equilibrium, which is rooted in their long-standing independent and active foreign policy.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, as a nation born out of a fierce, bloody anti-colonial struggle against the Dutch, and as a founding member of the non-aligned movement following the 1955 Bandung Conference, they possess a deep-seated institutional aversion to hosting foreign military bases or entering into binding formal alliances with any superpower.
So how do they handle the United States-China rivalry? They can't just ignore it.
They manage it by keeping a careful, calibrated distance from everyone. They welcome the United States' rebalance to the region because they fundamentally desire a strong counterbalance to any rising regional hegemon that might threaten their maritime sovereignty.
They want the United States around, just not in their house.
Exactly. They will conduct joint military exercises like Super Gruta Shield with the United States to build interoperability. However, they are incredibly wary of becoming too deeply integrated into Washington's strategic orbit. They focus intensely on building their own internal national resilience and actively try to position themselves as a neutral mediator and the quiet, stabilizing leader of the regional bloc, ensuring that no single external power dictates the terms of regional security.
So those are the core maritime players, largely looking outward to the sea for their security and economic frameworks. Now, let's pivot and look at the continental states, the ones firmly attached to the Eurasian landmass, leaning landward. We are talking about Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Their geographic reality is completely fundamentally different from Indonesia or the Philippines.
It is an entirely different strategic environment. These states share direct physical land borders, or in Cambodia's case, incredibly close, porous geographic proximity with the massive landmass of the People's Republic of China.
You can't escape geography.
As a direct result of this inescapable geography, their economies are deeply structurally integrated with the Chinese domestic economy. They rely overwhelmingly on Chinese infrastructure investment, cross-border trade, and the development of shared energy networks like the Mekong River dams.
Because of this profound geographic and economic reality, their strategic orientation leans heavily, almost exclusively, landward.
Precisely. They are far less concerned with complex maritime disputes in the South China Sea and far more concerned with maintaining highly stable, economically beneficial, and frictionless relations with their giant northern neighbor.
They don't want to rock the boat.
They understand that antagonizing Beijing carries immediate, severe economic and border security consequences. Consequently, within the regional diplomatic forums, they are consistently the most accommodating to Beijing's interests, often acting to block consensus statements that might directly criticize Chinese policy.
And then we come to Thailand, which Yuan Graham points out is a fascinating, almost contradictory paradox. Looking at the history books, Thailand is an official, major, non-North Atlantic treaty organization, treaty ally of the United States. They have deep historical military ties dating back to the Cold War. You would naturally assume they would be firmly entrenched in the maritime United States-leaning camp. But that is not at all what is playing out on the ground today.
Thailand offers a masterclass in the absolute pragmatism of survival diplomacy. Historically, they were the only nation in all of Southeast Asia to successfully avoid European colonization during the imperial era.
Which is incredible.
It really is. And they achieved that incredible feat by constantly, fluidly accommodating and balancing the various rising powers against one another, bending with the wind so the tree doesn't break.
I like that analogy.
Today, despite their formal, long-standing mutual defense treaty with the United States, that historical survival instinct has them increasingly leaning landward toward the People's Republic of China.
And that shift isn't just about geography, though. It is heavily influenced by their own internal domestic politics, isn't it?
Absolutely. The geopolitical shift has been significantly accelerated by internal political dynamics, specifically a series of military coups within Thailand. When a coup occurs, United States law and domestic political pressure often compel Washington to downgrade relations, suspend military aid, and criticize the lack of democratic norms.
Which creates a wedge.
It creates significant diplomatic friction. When the United States inevitably pulls back due to these human rights and democratic concerns, Beijing eagerly steps into the void, offering unconditional diplomatic support, massive infrastructure investment, and military hardware without any lectures on internal governance.
So they just pivot to where the friction isn't.
Exactly. This dynamic naturally pulls Thailand closer into the continental orbit of its neighbor, demonstrating how domestic politics can easily override a formal international treaty.
It perfectly illustrates that these alliances are not set in stone. They are living, breathing arrangements subject to domestic pressures. But as with any strategic framework, we cannot cleanly divide every single country neatly into land and sea categories. There are always fascinating outliers that completely break the mold.
Oh, definitely.
Vietnam is a prime example. Geographically, Vietnam is a continental nation. They share a long, complex land border with the People's Republic of China. They have a long history of land-based conflicts. But strategically, in the modern era, they act almost exactly like a maritime state.
Vietnam is perhaps the most strategically intriguing and dynamic player in the entire region right now. They possess a fierce, deeply ingrained history of violently defending their independence against larger powers, which notably includes fighting a bloody border war with the People's Republic of China as recently as 1979.
Not that long ago.
Right. They harbor deep historical suspicions of their northern neighbor. Today, their most acute immediate security concerns are overwhelmingly maritime, specifically regarding highly contentious territorial claims and energy exploration rights in the South China Sea.
So despite being a continental, single-party communist state that shares an ideological framework with Beijing, they are aggressively orienting their national security apparatus outward to the sea.
Yes. Because their primary threat vector is maritime, they are actively and aggressively seeking enhanced security ties, port visits, and diplomatic support from traditional maritime powers. They are deepening comprehensive partnerships with the United States, India, and Japan to actively counter and deter maritime pressure from Beijing. They are a quintessential continental state, employing a classic maritime balancing strategy to protect their sovereignty.
And the other fascinating outlier on Ewan Graham's map is Malaysia. Malaysia is functionally a maritime nation. They are geographically split between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Borneo, completely surrounded by water, and they control a significant portion of the vital Strait of Malacca. Yet their strategic behavior doesn't perfectly align with the other maritime states like the Philippines or Singapore.
Malaysia practices a strategy of deep, highly calculated ambivalence. On one hand, they are a maritime nation with significant overlapping territorial claims in the South China Sea that directly conflict with Beijing's claims. To hedge against this, they maintain very quiet, low-profile, but highly robust military-to-military ties, intelligence sharing, and logistical cooperation with the United States and other Western powers.
They want the security umbrella, but they don't want to make a lot of noise about it.
Exactly. Because on the other hand, they heavily and enthusiastically embrace Chinese economic integration. Their internal domestic politics, particularly the necessity of delivering continuous economic growth to maintain political stability among their diverse population, requires incredibly strong trade and investment ties with Beijing.
So they try to have it both ways.
They do. Therefore, they consciously choose to downplay their maritime disputes in public forums, seeking to extract the maximum possible economic benefit and infrastructure investment from the People's Republic of China, while quietly, behind the scenes, keeping the United States actively engaged as their ultimate strategic insurance policy.
It is a high-wire act for every single capital in the region. Which brings us smoothly to analyzing how this is all actually playing out in real dollars and concrete. The People's Republic of China is heavily promoting the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Initiative. It is a massive component of the Belt and Road, promising transformational wealth, new ports, and unprecedented connectivity. How is the region actually responding to these offers? We are going to dive deep into the empirical data from Xiaofeng Chen's rigorous research here.
Xiaofeng Chen provides a vital, necessary empirical reality check to the geopolitical rhetoric. It is very easy for outside observers to assume that because the region have a massive multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure deficit, every single country is eagerly and unquestionably signing up for whatever capital Beijing offers.
Right, like they're just taking whatever they can get.
But Chen's comprehensive data analysis breaks the regional responses down into three distinct, highly revealing tiers of support.
Let's walk through these tiers because they shatter the idea of a unified regional response. Tier 1 represents strong support. According to Chen's data, this tier consists of Cambodia, Laos, and Malaysia, Why are these specific countries fully buying in?
The rationales differ slightly, but they all driven by core developmental needs. For Cambodia and Laos, the calculation is relatively straightforward. They are developing lower-income economies with massive, crippling infrastructure deficits. They simply do not have the domestic capital to build out their nations.
They just need the money.
They view the initiative as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build the high-speed railways, the modern road networks, and the hydroelectric dams they could never possibly finance on their own. The influx of capital fundamentally transforms their physical landscapes and economic potential.
And what about Malaysia?
For Malaysia, particularly under previous political administrations, the strong support was largely viewed as a necessary mechanism to secure massive, rapid foreign capital to fund high-profile, legacy national development projects, calculating that the economic payoff was worth navigating the potential geopolitical strings attached.
Then we move to Tier 2, which Chen categorizes as conditional support or hedging. This is a much larger, more cautious group: Brunei, Indonesia, Myanmar, Singapore, and Thailand. They are definitely interested in the capital, but they are clearly nervous.
That is the essence of hedging. They absolutely want the investment money. They desperately need the modernized ports and the high-speed rail connectivity to remain globally competitive.
Yeah.
But they deeply, fundamentally fear for their long-term sovereignty.
Good risk.
They are acutely aware of the risks of becoming too asymmetrically economically dependent on a single massive neighbor, understanding that absolute economic dependence can quickly translate into political subservience and a loss of independent foreign policy.
So how do they manage that fear while still taking the money?
They accept the infrastructure projects, but only conditionally. They negotiate incredibly hard on the financing terms, often demanding lower interest rates. They insist on strict requirements for local technology transfer and the utilization of local labor rather than imported workforces.
Trying to keep control.
Most importantly, to offset the strategic weight of the Chinese capital, they actively and aggressively invite competing infrastructure investment from Japan, South Korea, or the United States to physically balance out the origins of the capital flowing into their countries. It is classic textbook hedging behavior designed to maximize benefit while mitigating sovereign risk.
And finally, we look at Tier 3, the swing states. This tier includes Vietnam and the Philippines. According to the data, their support isn't consistent. It is basically a roller coaster.
With the swing states, their level of support for the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Initiative fluctuates wildly from year to year. It depends almost entirely on two highly variable factors: who currently holds domestic political power in the capital, and what the immediate temperature of the maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea happens to be at any given moment.
It is entirely reactionary to the immediate environment.
Precisely. If naval tensions in the South China Sea are running dangerously high, with incidents of vessel ramming or water cannons being deployed, the political leadership in Manila or Hanoi will rapidly pull back from signing new economic initiatives with Beijing, prioritizing national defense and public sentiment over infrastructure.
And if things cool down?
Conversely, if a new political administration comes into power that explicitly prioritizes rapid economic development over asserting maritime sovereignty, they might suddenly execute a sharp pivot, downplay the territorial disputes, and fully embrace the initiative to secure funding. They are, without question, the most unpredictable actors regarding the long-term success of the Maritime Silk Road.
Now, here's the part of Xiaofan Chen's statistical research that is truly revelatory. When you ask a casual observer why a developing country supports something like the Belt and Road Initiative, the obvious common-sense answer is the money.
Sure.
You would logically assume that the countries receiving the highest volume of foreign direct investment, or the countries that maintain the most favorable, lucrative trade balances with the People's Republic of China, would naturally be the most vocal, steadfast supporters of the initiative.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is precisely where the rigorous statistical analysis reveals something deeply counterintuitive and fascinating. Chen's data empirically proves that the sheer volume of foreign direct investment and the status of trade imbalances do not actually possess a strong statistical correlation with a country's official level of support for the initiative.
So it's not just about the checkbook.
The sheer amount of money flowing across the border is surprisingly not the primary determining factor in state behavior.
If it is not the volume of capital driving the strategic decisions, what is actually steering the ship here?
The data strongly suggests that the decisions are almost entirely driven by internal domestic politics. Specifically, it revolves around the ruling elites in these respective countries and their desperate, constant need to maintain domestic political legitimacy.
Ah, keeping the voters or the population happy.
Right. In some developing nations, the ruling party's legitimacy relies almost entirely on their ability to deliver rapid, visible economic growth to a demanding population. Those specific elites will strongly and publicly support the initiative in order to get massive infrastructure projects built quickly, using them as tangible monuments of progress to show their citizens.
But in other countries, the mandate for legitimacy is entirely different.
Exactly. In other nations, the political elite's legitimacy is deeply tied to fiercely defending national sovereignty, historical pride, and territorial integrity. Those leaders will actively resist the initiative, regardless of the financial incentives, if accepting the money appears to compromise their territorial claims or makes them look weak to their domestic constituency. Furthermore, the underlying level of societal trust plays a massive, often underappreciated role.
You mean trust among the general population, not just the politicians?
Yes. In countries possessing deep, unresolved historical suspicions of Beijing, public pushback from civil society, opposition parties, and the media can literally force governments to reject, delay, or drastically renegotiate signed deals.
The people push back.
The public fundamentally fears falling into what is termed an infrastructure trap, the terrifying scenario of taking on massive, ultimately unsustainable sovereign debt to build a project, defaulting on those loans, and eventually being forced to surrender control of critical strategic national assets like a port or a power grid to a foreign creditor.
An infrastructure trap. It is a highly potent fear for a nation that spent centuries fighting for independence from colonial powers. Building a massive deep-water port you ultimately cannot generate enough revenue to pay for, and then watching a foreign state-owned bank effectively repossess the port. It makes perfect logical sense why domestic populations would be intensely wary, regardless of how many billions of dollars are theoretically being offered on a spreadsheet.
The historical memory is very long.
It is. This deep understanding of local dynamics leads us to our final major point of analysis today. We need to examine the myth of United States neglect versus Chinese inevitability. If you regularly read the standard op-ed pages of major Western newspapers, there's a very loud, pervasive, almost universally accepted narrative.
We hear it all the time.
The story generally goes like this. The economic and military dominance of the People's Republic of China over the entirety of Asia is an absolute unavoidable inevitability, and the United States is a fatigued, declining power that is slowly but surely withdrawing its presence from the Indo-Pacific region.
It is an incredibly common narrative, frequently repeated in policy circles. However, David Shambaugh's comprehensive work meticulously deconstructs this narrative point by point, utilizing hard data to prove it is largely a pervasive myth. The perceived narrative of a United States withdrawal is profoundly disconnected from the empirical reality of the United States' actual enduring footprint in the region.
Let's lay out the specifics of that footprint, because Shambaugh's data on the depth of American involvement is staggering. It is far more than just a few naval ships periodically sailing through the South China Sea.
It is vastly more comprehensive than that. The United States maintains a massive, deeply institutionalized, and multidimensional presence across the entire region. Diplomatically, despite occasional setbacks, the United States remains deeply engaged in the core architecture of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, participating heavily in forums like the East Asia Summit.
And what about soft power?
Culturally, the soft power influence of United States higher education, global media, and the English language remains utterly unmatched. Hundreds of thousands of the region's brightest students continue to seek out and study in the United States, creating generational ties.
And from a security perspective, the architecture is deeply entrenched.
Militarily, the United States maintains a sprawling, highly integrated network of formal mutual defense alliances, strategic security partnerships, massive joint military exercises, and continuous capacity-building programs that absolutely no other nation on Earth can currently replicate in the region.
They are heavily invested.
And, perhaps most surprisingly to many observers, economically, while the People's Republic of China might easily be the largest overall trading partner in terms of the raw volume of import and export goods, United States corporate investment, meaning actual finalized foreign direct investment that actively drives higher value manufacturing, technology transfer, and job creation, is historically staggering and remains far more deeply and permanently embedded in the foundational structures of the region's economies.
So if the objective data shows that the United States is still this massive, deeply embedded heavyweight in the region across all these domains, why does the narrative of their inevitable decline persist so stubbornly? Why does everyone in the region constantly feel like Washington is packing up and leaving? David Shambaugh points out a painful truth. The United States is exceptionally good at inflicting severe diplomatic wounds upon itself.
That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of United States diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. The pervasive narrative of American neglect isn't necessarily driven by a lack of resources, but rather by highly publicized, episodic lapses in high-level engagement.
Give us an example of that.
For example, a United States president decides to skip a major regional summit, perhaps due to a pressing domestic political crisis back in Washington or a budget standoff, and the entire region instantly interprets that singular absence as a definitive signal of strategic abandonment.
Because in Asian diplomacy, showing up is half the battle. Face-to-face engagement at the highest levels signals respect and commitment.
Exactly. Or, to look at a structurally devastating example, the United States spends years painstakingly negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was a massive, high-standard, multilateral trade agreement, explicitly designed to permanently anchor United States economic influence and rulemaking power in Asia for a generation.
A huge deal.
And then, abruptly, the United States entirely withdraws from the agreement due to shifting domestic political pressures regarding globalization. These types of self-inflicted wounds deeply and fundamentally damage the long-term credibility, predictability, and reliability of the United States in the eyes of Southeast Asian leaders who are risking their own political capital to align with Washington.
They are desperately looking for a steady, reliable partner to balance against their giant neighbor, and when that partner suddenly flakes on the most critical economic agreements, they understandably get very nervous and start hedging harder. But it is vital to note that the People's Republic of China isn't playing a flawless strategic game either. Shenbao's analysis highlights that Beijing consistently risks overplaying its own hand.
Absolutely. While the United States struggles significantly with diplomatic consistency and follow-through, Beijing struggles profoundly with the tone and execution of its approach. They frequently employ a heavy-handed, highly coercive style of diplomacy.
Pushing too hard.
They often demand immediate, asymmetrical economic concessions, or they utilize raw economic coercion, like suddenly restricting the import of a country's agricultural goods to punish smaller nations over minor political disagreements or perceived slights.
And that heavy-handed approach fundamentally misreads the psychology of the region.
It is a critical miscalculation. They often fail to appreciate the deep historical memory of these states. These are proud post-colonial nations. The populations and governments of Southeast Asia are fiercely, intrinsically protective of their hard-won independence and national sovereignty.
You can't just order them around.
When Beijing acts imperiously, or attempt to treat these nations as subordinate vassal states rather than sovereign equals, it predictably triggers a massive systemic immune response. Rather than forcing compliance, the coercion causes these nations to push back even harder, actively accelerating their efforts to seek out the United States and other powers to balance against the Chinese pressure.
Which brings us perfectly to the vital concept of relief valves within this geopolitical ecosystem. Because if this entire dynamic were genuinely just a binary, inescapable vice between the United States on one side and the People's Republic of China on the other, these smaller developing nations would eventually be crushed under the immense pressure. But the reality of omni-enmeshment means they aren't alone in the room with the two giants.
This is a vital, stabilizing part of the modern regional architecture. We must look at the role of the middle powers. Countries like Japan, Australia, and India serve as absolutely critical strategic pressure release valves for Southeast Asia. Japan, for instance, is a massive, highly trusted provider of high-quality infrastructure investment and foreign direct investment.
An alternative option.
They offer developing nations a highly viable, technologically superior alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, importantly, without the same heavy geopolitical baggage or fears of debt traps.
And the other middle powers offer different variations of support to diversify the portfolio.
Precisely. India is increasingly expanding its Act East policy, actively engaging in maritime security cooperation and naval exercises to protect the sea lanes. Australia provides vital, high-level defense training, intelligence sharing, and deep economic partnerships.
It gives them choices.
The active presence of these highly capable middle powers gives the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations a menu of alternative partners. This allows them to effectively diversify their strategic and economic portfolios, ensuring they can avoid the nightmare scenario of becoming entirely asymmetrically dependent on either Washington or Beijing.
It is an incredibly complex, constantly shifting, and surprisingly resilient ecosystem. Okay, we have covered a truly massive amount of intellectual ground today. We have analyzed infrastructure economics, strategic theory, geography, and superpower competition. So what does this all mean?
That is the big question.
If we step back and synthesize everything we have pulled from the brilliant research of Leah Go, Graham, Shambaugh, and Shen, I think the absolute biggest takeaway for anyone observing global politics is the sheer strategic brilliance of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
I would completely agree.
For decades, traditional Western analysts and media have treated these countries as passive victims, just small, helpless pawns waiting to be moved across a chessboard by the decisions of the great powers. But the empirical reality we've uncovered today proves the exact opposite. They are not pawns. They are the active, highly calculating architects of this incredibly complex, multi-layered regional order.
Their strategic agency is profound and undeniable. They designed the architecture of enmeshment. They refined the practice of complex balancing. They are not passively sitting by, waiting to see what the geopolitical weather will be dictated by Washington or Beijing. They are actively, constantly seeding the clouds to ensure the weather favors their own growth.
Seeding the clouds.
Their remarkable ability to stubbornly maintain their sovereign autonomy, manage intense superpower friction, and simultaneously drive their own rapid economic development while living directly in the shadow of this massive rivalry is a profound testament to their unparalleled diplomatic sophistication.
Exactly. They are playing a three-dimensional game of chess while everyone else is playing checkers. So for you listening at home, the next time you are scrolling through your morning newsfeed and you see a sensational headline about a Southeast Asian nation signing a massive multi-billion-dollar railway deal with the People's Republic of China, or conversely, a headline about that same nation hosting a United States aircraft carrier for a highly publicized joint military exercise, you now know how to look beneath the surface.
You have the framework now.
It is almost never about a country finally picking a side or surrendering to a superpower. It is almost always about a sovereign country executing another carefully calibrated, highly calculated move within the broader strategy of enmeshment. It is about meticulously balancing the geopolitical scales just enough to guarantee their survival and prosperity for another day.
This raises an important question, though, and it is a sobering one to consider as we conclude our analysis. We have rigorously established today that the entire brilliant survival strategy of Southeast Asia, this incredibly delicate, meticulously constructed web of enmeshment, relies fundamentally on one core structural pillar.
Right, the superpower overlay.
It requires keeping the United States actively, continuously engaged as the supreme superpower overlay to definitively balance the massive, localized, geographic, and economic weight of the People's Republic of China. But what happens to this entire system if deep structural domestic political shifts within the United States cause it to permanently, fundamentally lose interest in global engagement?
That would change everything.
What if a future administration in Washington definitively decides that the massive financial and military cost of maintaining the global order and securing distant sea lanes is no longer worth the burden to the American taxpayer? Can this intricate, meticulously balanced web of Southeast Asian diplomacy possibly survive if its primary structural anchor simply decides to fold its hand and walk away from the table?
That is a deeply chilling and frankly incredibly relevant thought to leave on. If the ceiling collapses, the entire meticulously designed tiered cake we discussed is crushed. It truly is a geopolitical house of cards, dependent on factors often far beyond the control of the nations living within it. Thank you all for joining us on this extensive journey into the strategic depths of Southeast Asia. We hope this deep dive empowers you to keep rigorously questioning the simplistic binary narratives you encounter in the daily news, to look much closer at the profound realities of the map, and to deeply appreciate the invisible, complex webs of diplomacy that are actively shaping the future of our world. Until next time, keep exploring and keep questioning.